Thank you very much. What a great song. Now, by the way, if you're new here or visiting, you just heard me say we're going to discuss a topic that is very controversial in churches today about the role of women. And immediately afterwards, Connie spoke. You say, so is that inconsistent? Well, that's what we're going to tackle in our men's Bible study. Because we want to see the culture, the context, and the application of all of this. And let me just say something else. This church doesn't function without the women in our church. Right, guys? Amen. And so it's very, very important. And so lest my humorous comments have some of you thinking there's no place for women, that is absolutely wrong and not what we do here. So, let's move forward. The fear of change. Now, as I said last week, people have this fear of change. And I cited a 19-year-old that was telling me, something I ran into, just about how I don't like things new. I like things the way they are. She's already an old soul, even though she's only 19 years of age. Even visionaries, it seems, struggle with change. It's interesting because we have these experts in our world. You know the experts, they know the answer to everything, right? And we have things called settled science that everybody says, well, that issue's settled and so forth. But I pulled up some stuff that I think you ought to be aware of where the experts have been wrong. So let me just show you some of them, all right? First of all, the New York Times. I don't think you can read it. I'll read it to you, okay? And you can get my notes afterwards if you'd like to see these. New York Times, 1936. A rocket will never be able to leave the atmosphere of the Earth. Yeah, New York Times, wrong. A professor at Oxford said, number 2, when the Paris exhibition in 1878 closes, electric lights will close with it. There is no place for electric lighting. How'd that go? Or Variety magazine regarding rock and roll. It'll be gone by June. Yeah, sure is gone by June. Sir William Preece, the chief engineer of the British Post Office, said, the Americans may need a telephone, but we don't. We have plenty of messenger boys to deliver the messages. Yeah, that worked out well. H.G. Wells, talking about submarines. He said, I must confess that my imagination refuses to see any sort of submarine doing anything but suffocating its crew and floundering at sea. Now that worked out. Or the aide-de-camp of Field Marshal Haig at a tank demonstration in 1916. He said the idea that the cavalry will be replaced by these iron coaches is absurd. It's just short of treasonous to have tanks instead of horses. And then there's Napoleon Bonaparte, the great leader in war. When he heard about Robert Fulton and this steamship where you actually had ships that were being powered by fire, he said, how, sir, would you make a ship sail against the wind and against the currents by lighting a bonfire under her deck? I pray you excuse me. I have no such time for such nonsense. Then the Boeing engineers, after they had developed the 247, a twin-engine plane that could carry an incredible payload of 10 passengers. There will never be, he said, and I quote, there will never be a bigger plane built. How'd that go? Oh, and then they were trying to get investors for this newfangled thing called the radio. And one of the leaders of Sarnoff's group said this, the wireless music box or radio has no imaginable commercial value. Who would pay for a message sent to no one in particular? Wrong again. And then there was the president of Digital Equipment, the great computer maker. He said initially at the World Future Society in 1977, there is no reason for an individual, any individual, to have a computer in his home. I guess we showed him who was wrong. Darryl Zanuck, the producer for 20th Century Fox, talking about television back in 1946. Television won't last because people will soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night. Are you tired yet? All right. And then there's the automobile. The president of the Michigan Savings Bank was advising Henry Ford's lawyer against investing in Ford's business. Why? He said, the horse is here to stay, but the automobile is only a novelty, a passing fad. Henry Morton, the president of the Stevens Institute of Technology, talking about Edison and his new light bulb back in 1880. Everyone acquainted with the subject will recognize it as a conspicuous failure. And then there's the president of IBM, Watson. I think, in 1943, I think there is a world market for probably 5 computers. Oh, and you'll like this. The United Artists executive, after rejecting Ronald Reagan to play the lead in a 1964 film entitled The Best Man, he made this statement about Ronald Reagan. Reagan doesn't have that presidential look. How'd that go? And then more about telephones. This is by the Western Union Company in a memo in 1876. This telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value to us. 2 more. Decca Records, after they declined to sign the Beatles in 1962. We don't like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out. They got that one wrong, didn't they? One more. Here's a real expert. Albert Einstein, 1932. You think he's right all the time? He said, there is not the slightest indication that nuclear energy will ever be obtainable. It would mean that the atom would have to be shattered at will. Albert Einstein, 1932. Experts don't always get it right. You know, it's interesting. I'm sort of a nerd when it comes about reading about Einstein, and I just finished Stephen Hawking's book on a brief history of time, and it never fails to amaze me how they dodged the big question. Even if you accept the Big Bang, where did it all come from? Hawking just says, well, that's not under our need to look at because that was before time and space. It just happened. Well, that's a great answer to that. And Einstein, not only was he wrong on nuclear energy, he was wrong on the Big Bang. He was also wrong on the expanding universe. And he also was wrong on quantum mechanics, which says there's random motion at the subatomic level. Wrong. And as I look at settled science, I'm one of those guys that says, you know, I don't buy into all of the experts. Because the experts of the past have been proven wrong, haven't they? Well, Jesus confronted, you say, how does this get into our message? Don't worry, I'm almost there. Jesus went face to face with the religious experts of his day. And he said, change has got to come. It's got to come. Now, there was especially one group that if you've been in church any length of time, every time you've heard about this group, the preacher sort of snarls. Because they were the group that were the greatest adversaries of Jesus. And he called them a bunch of vipers, whited graves. He had all kinds of things to say for them. None of them good. They were the adversary against Jesus. And they're the ones he rocked. But I'm going to tell you how they came around getting in place. I'm going to give you a little history about this group. And we're going to see why it was that they became so entrenched against Jesus. Now, I'm going to go back to the year 168 BC, and I'm going to introduce you to Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes. Doesn't that word Antiochus look like Antichrist? That's one of the things that every time I see it, it just sort of goes into my mind. And many people thought he was, by the way. They called him the Greek Hitler because he did a lot of stuff that Hitler did. Greece was ruling at that time over Israel. He instituted a program to annihilate the Jewish religion, Judaism. He killed literally thousands of Jews. He went into their temple, the Holy Temple, and he took a pig, which was an abomination to the Jews, and he had it slain on the altar there. And the juices of the pig spread throughout the whole temple thing, just to blaspheme their God and to do everything disgusting against Judaism. He attacked the true and living God. Now a group rose up, and about 3 years after Antiochus started all of this, they were led by a guy named Judas Maccabeus, or Judas Maccabee. And so in 165, he started this uprising. He and his sons, they were great warriors. They were great tacticians. They were outnumbered 6 to 1. And they won a great victory. The Jews to this day celebrate it with Hanukkah. or you've seen the menorah, which represents that they considered a miracle that God allowed them to overthrow Antiochus, and a great thing happened. Now, out of all of that, a group rose up called the Separated Ones. And they were determined that this would never happen again. And you need to know, they were good guys. Somebody wrote, their rise has been described as a story of raw courage, daring, heroics, and a deep dedication to God. They became national heroes. They wanted the Scriptures, their Old Testament, to be preserved. They taught it in their schools. They memorized it. They kept all of the ceremonial laws. They were evangelists as they reached out. They were givers. And they had this hope of the coming Messiah. You say, these can't be the enemies of Jesus. Hang on. Because within the time that Jesus came, something happened to them. They were also called the pious ones. Now, when you say the pious ones, there's a word, Hasidim, that means pious. Now, you may have seen some Hasidic Jews, and to this day they use that term. They consider themselves the pious ones. They look different, they dress different, they behave different, they've got the ear locks curling down, they've got all of the things that when you think about ultra-Orthodox Jews, you think of the Hasidic Jews. It means the pious ones. Well, this group, today, we call them by a different name. We call them the Pharisees. And it seems like every time we mention Pharisees in the church, there's a low boo, those are the bad guys, the separated ones, the pious ones. They were the ones that had Jesus crucified. They were the ones that early on said, we need to take him out. So the question is, what happened? As they started out as the heroes defending God, and then when God came, they crucified him. What happened? Well, let me just show you. As we go to chapter 6 of Luke, for those of you that are here with us for the first time, we're studying the life of Jesus, and things are going to really get interesting. We'll have this sermon, and then next week we're going to see the 12 that he called, and we're going to just slow down on those 12 because I want to see them as individuals. They were people like us. We're going to see what they did. So here it says, working on the Sabbath. One Sabbath, Jesus went through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Now, grain fields. If you were to go to Israel in the Jordan Valley, you would see these beautiful grain fields. And what would happen is you say there's a path through there. Yeah, because what the people would do is rather than go around, they would go through them, and there was a path that went through there. And so it was the harvest time, and so they were going through this. Now, not only the harvest time, but it was also the Sabbath. Now, when is the Sabbath? Sometimes we as Christians inaccurately refer to Sunday as the Sabbath. Here's what the Bible says about the Sabbath. By the way, it's a Saturday Sabbath. Exodus chapter 20, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all the work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work. Now, we meet on Sunday, you say, did we get it wrong? Now, there are some Messianic Christians that say we ought to go back to the Sabbath. But the New Testament in Colossians makes it clear we are not to observe Sabbath or their ceremonies anymore. And when we look at the early church, what they did is Jesus rose on what day? Sunday. And they referred to Sunday as the Lord's Day. And as we read about them, they gathered every week on the Lord's Day. And Jesus changed a lot of things. For those old Jewish folks that got converted, that must have been really, really difficult. Well, so it's a Sabbath. And Jesus is walking along with his disciples, and they're moving their way through a wheat field, a grain field, and they're a little hungry. And so what they did is they reached over, grabbed some of these things, put them in their hands, and rubbed them together to get all the husk off, and then popped them in their mouth. I've never tried it. If I see a wheat field one of these days, I'm going to do that. But the Pharisees looked at it in verse 2, and here's what they said. Now, some of the Pharisees asked, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? What are you thinking? Now, you're trying to win a crowd, you're not going to win it this way. You're violating one of God's rules. Well, let's stop there. Exodus 34:21 says, 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during the plowing season and harvest you must rest. Now, here's what happened. Were they harvesting? Well, the Pharisees had come up with add-ons to the rules that God gave. And so they said, well, if they're picking grain, that's labor, and they're rubbing it, and that's work, therefore, it must be the harvest. Now, God never said that. God's laws were compassionate. In Deuteronomy, and I won't go into all the details, it says if you're walking through your neighbor's vineyard and you're hungry, take some grapes and eat them. But it says, but don't take a basket. In other words, don't harvest his crop. But if you're hungry, take some. And then it goes on, it says if you enter your neighbor's grain field, he says you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to a standing grain. Don't steal his crops. But it's okay. And God did not exclude the Sabbath. The Pharisees did. So let's meet these guys. We're going to see them for a long time as we study the life of Jesus. And I'm going to ask the question, they started out so well, what went wrong? What went wrong? And what does it mean to us? Okay, that's where the rubber meets the road. The so what? What does it mean to us? Number one, they added their opinion to God's opinion. They had so much respect for the original scriptures, they wanted to protect them, so they started adding new rules all around them to make sure that they didn't violate scriptures. And as a matter of fact, when Jesus saw all that they had thrown on top of it, he referred to it as being absurd. What have you done to my Father's laws? You have put so much junk on top of them that people can't even see the law anymore. Number two, they erected more and more siags, which is really the word for fences. I'll call it fences. They called it siags. They erected more and more fences. They were so determined to make sure nobody fell off the cliff that they had fences going further and further away from the edge. And so that people had no chance of even getting close to the edge because they had more fences. They contrived Pharisaic rules that if a man would keep their rules, God would accept him into heaven. Therefore, if God said, you will not work on the Sabbath, then don't you dare pick grain because that's labor. You say, well, it's really, God said don't harvest. Yeah, but that could be conceived as harvest. And these laws became known as the Pharisees' fences. And they just took great pride in coming up with more and more fences. And eventually, they said, if you obey and stay outside the fences, you're okay, God would accept you. And the Pharisees were pros at it. Now, number three, their opinions eventually began to outweigh God's opinions. They had added so much stuff. For example, when it came to the Sabbath, if you were a good, observant Jew, you would not bathe on the Sabbath. You say, God didn't say that. Oh, God said not to work on the Sabbath. And if you are bathing and you happen to spill some water, then you need to clean it up, and that's working. So don't take a bath. And they started putting all kinds of rules on. For example, don't carry a burden because that would be work. Well, then they would argue about how heavy is a burden. And eventually they determined a burden was the weight of a dried fig. So you couldn't carry anything more heavy than a dried fig. They had the Sabbath day journey. Well, to go on a long walk would be work, and so how far can you go? And so they had these very strict rules about how many yards they could go. And they had all kinds of gimmicks to get around. They took great delight, it seems, in circumventing the very rules that they made. And by the way, if this was the Sabbath and you were Jewish, you would not dare look in a mirror. Why? You know what? You might spot a gray hair, and you might be tempted to pluck it out, and that would be considered work. You say, that sounds foolish. They were. Jesus looked at this and said, what have you done to my Father's loving commandments? And as I do this, all I can do is think about Fiddler on the Roof, where Tevye starts singing tradition. Tradition. We can't do it that way. We've never done it that way. And that was the Pharisees. Jesus came along and said, I'm changing everything. We're not under the law anymore. Plus, you guys have hidden my law under all your rules. Number 4, the fences push people farther from God, not closer. They began to see themselves, those that obeyed it, as holier than other people. And it became one of these things, well, if so-and-so doesn't do this, then I'll not do this, so I'm holier than they are. And they were called the separated ones. Eventually, they became such separatists that they would not associate with sinners because they were holier. They wanted to look pious. Their dress reflected it. And rather than changing the heart, they changed their appearance and their behavior. And right there is where we're headed. Because for us, it's not about changing the appearance. It's changing the heart. And people, when they come to Christ, need to change from the inside out and not change all of the things associated with their life first. God will work on that. And some of you this morning may be grappling with this, where you think if you can do all of the rules or perceived rules or traditions or all that you've heard, you're good with God. And God says, no, I'm looking at the heart. How's your heart? How's your heart? Let's go to number 5. They failed to understand the importance of discernment. Now, Jesus answered them, verse 3. He said, after they had asked, why are you working on the Sabbath? Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, the tabernacle, and taking the consecrated or holy bread, he ate what is lawful only for the priest to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Let me tell you the story. When we read in 1 Samuel chapter 21, David and his men are a band on the run. These are the mighty men of valor that David had. Saul was still king. God had anointed David. David is on the run from Saul. And they came to the tabernacle, and after a long flight, they were hungry. And so they went to the priest, and they said, do you have any common bread, regular bread? You know, peanut butter and jelly sandwich type bread? No, don't have any. The only thing I have here are the holy bread. The holy bread. Well, David knew exactly what that was, because if you knew their tabernacle, every morning they brought the showbread in, the showbread, and presented the loaves to God, and they sat on a table inside the holy place in the tabernacle. Okay? And so as it sat there, nobody touched it, but at the end of the day, the next day, they would come in with fresh loaves. And the old one, you say, what did they do with the old one? Well, you're not going to throw it away. So the priest ate it. And so what happened is David came in, the priest didn't have it, and he said, give it to David and his men. They're hungry. And you say, well, is that discernment? Yes, you discern it. Of course God wouldn't mind that happening. Nor would God mind guys eating the grain out of the field as they're walking through. That's not work. That's common compassion. Jesus then closed with a blockbuster. Jesus looked at him and said, and the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. I can just see this, just eyeball it. And this is me. I made the Sabbath. Son of Man is Jesus' favorite term for himself. And they knew what he was saying. The Son of Man, standing right here, is the Lord of the Sabbath. I rule the Sabbath. And what I'm doing is okay in the first place, but if it isn't, I rule the Sabbath and I can do it. Now, let me just talk a little bit. So this is sort of, let's go a little recent history. I've been back 2,000 years ago. Let's go 100 years ago. And I think it's important to see fences as it relates to Protestant church history. About 100 years ago, there was a huge battle fighting in the United States. And some of you, well, nobody here that I'm aware of was born then. And if you were, you wouldn't remember it. But within the mainline churches of all denominations, and in their seminaries especially, European theological liberalism had become very entrenched. What do I mean by that? Not liberal in a political sense, but liberal in the sense that they denied or seriously doubted the deity of Jesus Christ. Now, that's a problem. Last week we did core values, we hammered them down, and we believe the Bible is telling the truth and literally saying regarding Jesus Christ. They doubted or denied the virgin birth. And eventually what they were saying in theological liberalism in the seminaries, many of the seminaries 100 years ago, was that the Bible is sort of a guidebook, but you can't take it seriously. Well, there were people that take it seriously, like us, our ancestors, if you will. And they said, we're going to stand up against this. And seminaries started getting fractured, denominations fractured, where a man such as me would stand up in this church, if it was a denominational church, and in a group that had gone liberal, and our church said, look, we don't buy into the liberalism, we believe the Word of God, and we're out of here. And they would say, yes, but we own the building. You guys can leave, but it's our building. And across the nation, churches were losing their buildings, pastors were blacklisted, but they said, we will stand on the fundamentals of the faith. Please don't misinterpret the fundamentals of the faith with fundamentalism. Huge difference. The fundamentals of the faith were put down in a book, or a pamphlet, if you will, called The Fundamentals of the Faith. And they said 5 things that we will die for as a church. Number 1, the inerrancy and authority of the Word of God. We believe this. And we believe, number 2, in the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. And we believe in substitutionary atonement, that it was through grace we are saved. Not in our own works, but through Jesus Christ. And then fourthly, we believe that Jesus literally rose from the dead. The liberals said no. And then lastly, we believe in the glorious return of Jesus Christ for His people. Now you say, I would say amen to all of those, wouldn't you? And so this church, if we were facing what they faced, we would have to make a decision. This pastor would say, we're out of here, even if it cost us a building, because our fundamentals are too important. They went out and they separated from apostasies. Churches started breaking away. There were men of God and women of God that took a stand, and they are heroes. They were fighting over not only core values, but core beliefs. Now, let's pause there. That was a great fight. But then the fence builders came in. Okay, the fence builders. Well motivated, as were the Pharisees initially. They wanted to protect the Word of God. They wanted to remain separate from evil. And so they started doing things. Now this is where it starts getting a little more personal. They started looking at lifestyle. And as especially the 60s rolled around, and everybody was doing crazy things, they tried to define what needed to be done. As you know, I go back periodically to Cornerstone University, where I sit on their board of trustees. And I sit there with 5, there are 4 other guys that were students there during my time in the 60s. And we didn't have a great experience. And what I like to say is now Cornerstone has become the school we always hoped it would be. And it has made that transition, where the heart as opposed to your attire became more important. When I was there, we said that the 3 things that this group of fundamentalists were fighting for was hair, hymnlines, and harmonies. Hair length, hymnlines for the women, and music. You know, did it have too much rock and roll in it? You know, was the skirt too short? Was the hair too long? And we got into all kinds of stuff like that. And it left a bad taste in a lot of people's minds. And then there was the issue of separation. Now, we need to separate from those that are apostate. But that doesn't mean we separate from sinners. Because if we follow the example of Jesus and the disciples, they went to the sinners and loved the sinners. Nor do we separate from other Christian brothers and sisters who have minor variations in what we believe and what they believe. We can still embrace them. There is one church. And if you know Christ as your Savior, you're a member of them. And what I've learned is all you have to do is just look at Fallbrook, and there are so many different groups, and so many of them love Jesus Christ just like we do. But they differ on certain doctrinal issues. They all may have Jesus returning at different periods, us going to heaven at different periods. But they love Christ, and they're looking forward to His glorious return. A new form of legalism started to develop in fences. And by the way, people were well-meaning, just like the Pharisees started out that way. They said, for example, God says abstain from adultery. So when we were in college, they certainly didn't want any fornication going on. It was a Bible college. They said, so let's go ahead and set some fences. For example, You know, movies could enhance this desire. No movies. It's not only the good ones. It's just none of them. Dancing, other things that they felt needed to be erected. Fences started going up everywhere. And what happened is some of the students came through that really damaged through this, because not always was the heart there. The motives were good, but sometimes the heart wasn't there. The result, everything became black and white. I nearly got kicked out my freshman year. You need to know your pastor. Nearly got thrown out of Bible college. And that was before I knew Carolyn, so she has nothing to do with it. My great sin was I went to see The Sound of Music. And I'd been told movies were evil. I got out of that and said, that didn't feel real evil. That didn't feel real evil. And so this idea of discernment, how do you discern between The Sound of Music and some really trashy movie? And so a lot of the students, when they got away from school, they just didn't know how to discern. The result, everything was black and white. And we started fighting over the fences rather than over the important things. Now, things to remember as I close this up. Our spiritual ancestors the last 100 years fought a courageous battle. A battle that, we talk about them being battling Christians back then. They had to. They were fighting against our core faith that was under attack. They were fighting for our core faith, about the deity of Jesus Christ, the resurrection of Christ from the dead, the virgin birth. Those are things we need to stand firm on. Those are the fundamentals. And the people that came through and saw all the social turbulence really tried to protect the children, but in some ways built fences that shouldn't have been built there. And students didn't learn how to discern. I look at all of these when I think about this. I don't know if I should go here, but I've already gone places I shouldn't go today. The Shrine Circus would always come to town in Grand Rapids. You ever go to the Shrine Circus? Well, you would have these guys, middle-aged guys, riding these crazy things. Little cars or little motorcycles with funky little hats and all this kind of stuff, doing these things. And you would look at that and you couldn't help but laugh, you know. They didn't think it was funny. They were part of the club. This is what they did. All their buddies did it. In some ways, when I think about that, I say that we have to make sure that the church doesn't become like the Shriners, where people come in and say, you know, they're a funny group in there. They do their little things. They have their little cliches. And in essence, figuratively, they're riding their little vehicles all around. And they don't realize they're out of touch with humanity. When we talk about change, we need to make sure that we are engaging our culture. And I believe the heart of this church is to do it. And historically, this church has. And as we look to the future, we live in this culture and we will engage our culture. And as changes are needed in how we do ministry, not the core values, not our theology, not the Bible, but how we do things, we need to be very, very discerning in when to make changes. Now you say, is he going to bring a list of big changes that need to be made? That is certainly not my goal this morning. Because the leadership of this church has been good as we continue to move forward, and we look forward to what we're going to do. But it's good to see that Jesus confronted a group of religious leaders. And whenever you do it, sometimes those that are very comfortable don't like to let go. Now last week, we closed with one of the verses that Jesus said. And he said, no one after eating old wine wants the new. In other words, they feel the old is better. Sometimes it's hard to let go of things. For me, it's hard to let go of things. And I think I'm a pretty forward-thinking visionary. But we need to discern what needs to be done. All right, I have no agenda other than what God said on this. So some of you are waiting for me to drop a bombshell. No, I'm not going to drop a bombshell. So, working on the Sabbath, and I'm going to close with a second one. Healing on the Sabbath. I love how Jesus works. I mean, I love him as the Son of God. But listen to this one, okay? So on another Sabbath, Luke 6:6, Jesus went into the synagogue and was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law, I mean, they've been stalking Jesus. They were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. He's already harvested grain on the Sabbath. Now if we can catch him healing, we've got him. Jesus never flinched. Verse 8. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them being the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or destroy a life?" He's just looking at it. All right, so what is lawful? To do good or to do evil? To save a life or to destroy a life? He looked around at them all, didn't say anything else, and then he looked to the man. He said, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. It's like Jesus saying, "All right, so what's your next move? You don't want me to heal on the Sabbath? I just did. What are you going to do?" And by the way, Mark talks about this and gets into what Jesus was feeling. It says this in Mark 3:5. Jesus looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. You say, Jesus in anger? He looked at these religious leaders that were so involved with obeying the rules, the traditions, the externals, and he looked at them in anger and distress at their stubborn heart. Now, how did the Pharisees respond? Chapter 6, verse 11 of Luke. But they, the Pharisees, were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. Mark cuts to the quick even better. Mark says in Mark 3:6, and they began to plot how they might kill Jesus. All right, so there the plot now thickens. They realize they can't control this man. They need to kill him. He is threatening their empire, their way of doing things, what they perceived was true religion. Now, how do I close this? And I am going to close it. Back in the 1950s and 60s, these issues were really raging. How do you know if a person is truly spiritual? Now, I mean, that's a great question that I have to ask myself. Will I become spiritual by reading the Bible in a year? And I'm on that. And by the way, I'm still on target on that through the Bible, and many of you are doing it. That won't make me spiritual, though. It really. Now, I will learn things that enhance my opportunity to understand God better. And if I follow through and if I have prayer associated with that, yes, yeah, that can. But if I just say, all right, check that off, I read the Bible this year. If I dress appropriately, if I behave appropriately, does that make me spiritual? Francis Schaeffer really grappled with this. A thinker far deeper than me. And he's looking at this and saying, what is true spirituality? He wrote a book. He entitled it True Spirituality. He wrote it in 1971. And it was a blockbuster. Because in his articulate way, you can read the whole book, but can I summarize the book? He said, change needs to come from the inside out, not the outside in. And Jesus said the same thing. He said, you want to know what the greatest commandment is? You are to, and here it is, I want you to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Your heart needs to change. And then Jesus said, oh, and by the way, there's a companion commandment, number 2. He said, I want you to love your neighbor like yourself. And you know what? That's hard to do unless your heart has been changed. And if you have not the love of Christ in you. For example, it is commonly known that many people will say that the number one way to tell whether a person is a believer, the first evidence is that they will love each other. They will know we are Christians by our love for one another. Those are all heart things, aren't they? And if there's some habits that you bring into your salvation that you'd like to get rid of, I say, well, let's get you saved first, and then let the Holy Spirit work on those things that need to be cast off. And if the heart is changed, that happens. Now, some of you are here, and you are struggling in your daily walk, and all of the rigors of being a Christian are just weighing you down. Let me just ask you to concentrate on your heart, your personal relationship with Christ. Talking to Him, listening to Him for a quiet time of devotion in your life. And to say, God, my heart needs to be changed. I don't feel that love in it. Or, I love you, but I don't love you with all my heart, and all my strength, and all my thoughts. I've held back a portion. And God, I want you to take it. I want to love you with everything I've got. And then, God, would you help me love my neighbors? I have trouble with my neighbors. I don't necessarily love them. They're a little annoying. Lord, help me to love them. It might still be annoying, but help me to love them. Help me to love my children more. Help me to love my mother more on Mother's Day. And just ask God to do it for you. How do you change? Don't worry about the externals. The message today is change comes from the inside out. And if our hearts are right with God, it is amazing how He can give us discernment in the other areas. I trust Him on that. Father, I thank you for this time to preach your word. I pray, Father, that I have not been unduly critical of other believers. But, Father, I pray that I've been honest about some of the challenges that our churches have faced. And I just pray, Father, that you will help those that are struggling, that have been so concerned about looking and acting and dressing and behaving like a Christian, that they have forgotten that you really want to change our hearts first. Father, I pray for changed hearts. I pray that we might be so in love with you, we cannot help but love our neighbors. And we cannot help but show our love for one another. We ask these things in the name of the Lord of the Sabbath. Amen.